Oh, he goes once a week at least. Yes. If you want a real hardware shop, you want to go up to McGill Road, there is that old-fashioned hardware shop, and it's still there.
And they test, but they know what you want.
Yeah, they do. It's on the St Bernard's Road, McGill Road, just there, and it's a real old-fashioned hardware shop. You know.
There used to be one, we used to have to go to a new store. But they stopped doing it.
Right, okay. That's all. Anyway, we saw it the other day. I've used it because I used to work at review at church, and so I've been to it. That's all I just don't No, it's not that. That's yes, that's right. I've been there a few times.
Keep his nose down and do the work. Or some human factors. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and a welcome to those of us who are joining online. It's nice to know that it's not just the confines of this wall that surrounds the building, but we are actually incorporating people who are outside this building. This is the first event for the 2025 Progressive Christianity Forum, and as chair of the, or I should say coordinator, I think, of the, or what's the other word, Kym? Some other word that's equivalent, of the Progressive Christianity Network (SA) Task Group, I do welcome you. We've adopted as our theme for this year, challenges, questions and values we face in engaging with the church and the world. So it's a very long title, but the operative word is questions. And our emphasis on questions in preferences to answers is clear in the brochure, a replica of which appears on the screen there, which is replete with questions. And indeed, if you check through the list of our events, 10 of the 11 events, including tonight's, are framed as questions. A certainty is notably absent, and that's very much in the spirit of progressive Christianity. Can I remind anyone who's seen the film Conclave, has anybody seen it? Jolly good film, yes. Of the events that happened when Ralph Fiennes, playing the role of Cardinal Lawrence, Dean of the College of Cardinals, delivers a little homily in advance of the process through which the cardinals need to go in choosing the new pope, the old pope having died. And Cardinal Lawrence is very much of our mind. And his opening words were these, and I checked them on the web because I couldn't remember them on first fly. Certainty is the great enemy of unity. Certainty is the great enemy of tolerance. If there was only certainty and no doubt, there would be no mystery and therefore no need for faith. They sort of echo the words that are on our brochure. And if I can quote those that's inside the brochure, many of the world's old certainties are gone or in retreat. Those of us who seek to express an authentic faith need to find new ways to engage with a world in flux. Multiple crises that invade us, instant communications and connectivity, and widespread loss of confidence in institutions challenge us to find new ways to be faithful to our calling. And tonight's event is very much aligned with these words. How can we live in a time of polycrisis and hyperconnectivity? So the words poly and hyper amplify the crisis that we face. The event will aim to explore this question, proposed by acclaimed progressive Christian writer and public theologian Brian McLaren, and through the applications of systems thinking. Our speaker tonight to address this challenging subject is Kym Bills, who is well placed to steer us through this important topic. He has a BA with honours, a Bachelor of Economics, a Bachelor of Literature, Master of Science and a Master of Ministry. And not sufficient with this, he's also engaged in studies towards a PhD. He was a foundation head of the Australian Transport Safety Bureau and a former CSIRO CEO of a Perth-based research joint venture. Kym's academic and professional background and the fact that he is our esteemed colleague on the task group as a member puts him in an excellent position to address tonight's topic. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Kym and leave him in charge of the proceedings from this point on. Thanks, Kym.
I feel like it's a scene from Macbeth, was the forest moving, but thank you. Good evening to you all, those who are here, have braved the heat and have left the cricket on the TV, and also to those who are watching online. It's the practice and privilege of Christchurch and the Effective Living Centre to acknowledge our First Peoples. So in the spirit of reconciliation and support for the Uluru Statement from the Heart, we give thanks for the opportunity to live among First Nations people. We acknowledge that we gather on the land of the Kaurna people, whose spiritual sovereignty flows through the generations. We pay our respects to the elders who were and who are, for they hold the memories, the traditions, the culture and hopes of Kaurna people today. So, as Don said, the Progressive Christianity Forum for this year has the theme of challenges, questions and values we face in engaging with the church and the world. As we will discuss this evening, polycrisis and hyperconnectivity present massive challenges for the world, raise many questions and test humanitarian and faith values. Unless we put our heads in the sand through distractions of bread and circuses, these days drugs, sport and social media, yes, I did say sport, considering how we can and should live in such a time will be complex and confronting. The Doomsday Clock was created in 1947, after World War II, at the start of the Cold War, by atomic scientists including Albert Einstein and Robert Oppenheimer. It powerfully summarises nuclear and other threats to the world's existence. Initially, it read 7 minutes to midnight. In 2023, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it had moved forward to 90 seconds to midnight, its most perilous position ever. This is due to threats to world existence from climate, nuclear and biological sources, wars and unchecked artificial intelligence. Last month, on the 28th of January, the clock moved forward another second to 89 seconds to midnight. This reflected President Trump's announced exit for the United States from both the Paris Climate Accord and also from the World Health Organization. So this slide provides an outline of tonight's forum, including defining and explaining the topic and 2 substantial periods for discussion, which I'll tell you about when we get to that point. Okay, so polycrisis is a label for multiple major and potentially existential threats we face as a result of, among other things, global warming, climate change and weather catastrophes, pollution, environmental degradation and loss of species, pandemics, plagues and resistance to antibiotics, the rise of autocrats, despots and challenges to democracy and the rule of law, wars and the proliferation of nuclear, biological, chemical, space and cyber weapons of mass destruction, global population growth to over 10 billion people and uncontrolled mass migration, rising inequality and lack of access to food, water and shelter, and misuse of powerful artificial intelligence and robotics. Hyperconnectivity is a term that emphasises close linkages between multiple crises and their roots, with other factors including nationalism and intolerant ideologies, rampant capitalism and consumerism, and religious fundamentalism and extremism. This is amplified by the internet and by some traditional and social media that decry as fake news anything they disagree with, use alt facts, and promote more convenient, constructed truth. In the misappropriated name of free speech, platforms like X allow chatbots or other cyber tools that apply almost instantly without fact-checking or consideration of potential or likely serious consequences. Platforms with more views and likes make more money. Forms of Nazi or Marxist propaganda in soft and hard forms become more pervasive. Hyperconnectivity can lead to social unrest and financial crisis nationally and internationally, as well as damage to individuals, such as by encouraging teen suicide or criminal stabbing, copycats and terrorist violence. The combination of polycrisis and hyperconnectivity is a threat to humanity and the planet and cannot be wished away. So the question arises as to how we can, and perhaps should, live in such a perilous time. We've just witnessed extreme polarisation and challenges to both domestic and international norms during the United States federal election and, of course, the first couple of weeks of the Trump presidency. We face widespread insecurity because of the rise of autocrats, wars such as in Ukraine and the Middle East, tensions in the South China Sea and over Taiwan, pandemics, rising inequality, and many other factors. But perhaps the greatest sources of insecurity are climate change linked to human activity from excessive population growth and consumption, and elites seeking more power and wealth using whatever means they deem necessary. You've probably heard the expression that for every complex problem, there is an answer that is simple, clear, and wrong, or something like that. The original quotation is the one there. Explanations exist, they have existed for all time. There is always a well-known solution to every human problem. Neat, plausible, and wrong. It's from H.L. Mencken in 1917, who was a journalist and satirist known as the Sage of Baltimore. We've long relied on the sciences to understand many individual problems and address their components. But increasingly, complex interconnected systems need to be considered holistically. While not sufficient to ensure success, systems thinking is necessary to understand and address such complexity. The United Nations agency, ICAO, summarised recently that systems thinking is an approach to view systems in a holistic and integrated manner, rather than as isolated components or parts. It examines the links and interactions between the elements that comprise the whole of the system. Systems thinking is particularly useful in addressing complex systems where small changes in one part of the system can lead to large and unexpected effects in the overall system. The scientific method questions key assumptions and actively seeks to disprove established explanations. It also documents evidence that may probabilistically confirm a theory, model, or conclusions as likely being true. Much progress in science has come from the creation of new specialised disciplines and by splitting problems into constituent elements and addressing them. However, what is termed emergence produces systems with different properties at higher levels of complexity. Complex systems can have sensitive dependence on initial conditions, where a tiny change can lead to large consequences, positive or negative. Mathematician Edward Lorenz illustrated this by the metaphor of a butterfly flapping its wings, leading to major, seemingly unrelated changes in weather. As I mentioned, complex interconnected systems need to be considered holistically and not just broken down into subproblems. At a global level, systems tipping points can suddenly change apparent relative stability into chaos and catastrophe. Some tipping points are likely to be reached within quite short timescales and are hard to reverse, given scientific, politico-economic and other factors involved. Increasingly, problems are so complex that only a holistic systems thinking approach that straddles multiple disciplines can address them. Examples include climate change, poverty, mass migration and war. In my field of accident prevention, I've published an article about pioneers in systems thinking and have another article about a systems thinking philosophical paradigm currently under review in a leading journal. You can relax, I will say nothing more about that tonight. Science and understanding of systems thinking is important for a progressive Christianity that preferences humble learning and questions simplistic facts, including of dogma and fundamentalism. Simplistic solutions are argued by the ignorant, by snake oil salespersons, and as propaganda. Systems thinking is also necessary to address a large number of smaller and more limited management and socio-technical problems. Two classic books on systems thinking that deal with a wide spectrum of such issues are by Senge and Meadows. Peter Senge's The Fifth Discipline, The Art and Practice of the Learning Organisation, was published in 1990 and has sold well over 1 million copies. Senge says systems thinking is the fifth discipline in the title because it is the conceptual cornerstone that underlies all 5 learning disciplines in the book. Donella Meadows was lead author for a famous 1972 book for the Club of Rome called The Limits to Growth. Some of you may be old enough to even remember that. I am. It anticipated many of the world's current problems, but was unfairly criticised at the time because they did not happen fast enough, even though the book's analysis assumed many decades. After she died in 2001, Meadows' colleagues and fans around the world continued to use her MIT lecture notes. The draft of Thinking in Systems, a primer that was based on the lectures, was published posthumously in 2008. Emeritus Professor Dr. Michael Jackson, OBE, has studied systems since 1978, with the first book on systems management published in 1991. In 2019, his massive 700-page Critical Systems Thinking and the Management of Complexity was published. His 2004 Critical Systems Thinking, A Practitioner's Guide, and he's obviously very proud of both of these books, updates part of the 2019 book, but is a third the length and much more accessible for the general reader, should you be motivated to look for it. Jackson summarises critical systems thinking as a systems approach that aims to assist decision makers to better understand and address the complex issues they face. So a very broad definition. And to address increasingly complex local situational problems, as well as the wicked global issues that are our focus tonight. Critical systems practice is the heart of the book and is analysed using 4 stages: explore, produce, intervene and check. Explore the situation of interests includes use of 5 systemic perspectives termed mechanical, interrelationships, organismic, purposeful and societal environmental. To produce an intervention strategy includes choosing an appropriate systems methodology from options like engineering, system dynamics, living systems, soft systems and emancipatory systems. Intervene stresses flexible use of methodologies, models and methods, and staying alert to the evolving situation of interest and being prepared to change. And to check on progress requires rigorous systemic evaluation. Now, if I haven't depressed you enough already, a report last month by the International Faculty of Actuaries, IFOA, assisted by Exeter University, highlights that risks and costs of climate change have been underestimated. Their new risk analysis-based scenarios find that without massive action to decarbonise and restore nature by 2050, global GDP may halve in 2070 to 2090, particularly because of climate change-induced weather shocks and interconnected and cascading tipping points. This, you may be slightly happy to know, is their worst case extreme risk analysis scenario based on a 3 degrees Celsius or more average temperature increase by 2050 that, among other things, leads to more than 4 billion deaths, high-level extinctions and socio-political breakdown. A second, slightly less bad, catastrophic scenario based on a 2 to 3 degrees Celsius temperature rise by 2050 results in a 25% global GDP loss, 2 billion deaths still, and uncontrolled migration involving billions of people. Limiting the global average temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius by 2050 leads to a third decimation scenario, using the original meaning of decimation based on a Roman legion's loss of 1/10 of its soldiers. So with a 10% or more loss of GDP and 10% or greater than 800 million deaths and ongoing extinction events. And a fourth, least bad and much more optimistic severe scenario assumes global warming based on an average temperature increase of 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2050 after an overshoot, given that we're already at 1.5 degrees Celsius, leading to 5% or more loss of GDP and 5% or more additional global deaths, equivalent to more than 400 million lives lost. So, with that sobering start, here is our first of two discussion periods. So, remembering our online attendees, please put up your hand to ask a question or make a comment. If chosen, come up to the microphone here. Speak clearly into it. I'll move to one side. Limit any question or comment to 30 seconds if you possibly can, so that others can have a turn. And you might wish to focus on the frightening IFOA 2025 report I've just talked about, the concept of polycrisis and hyperconnectivity, or the importance of systems thinking. You will have another slightly longer discussion period after I talk about McLaren and a few more things. So, who would like to raise their hand and be first to ask a question or make a comment? Max, come forward.
Nothing specific, just that it would be really easy to be overwhelmed by it all. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, we need to find a balance between being upset enough to do something about it, and also not lose hope. And we probably should say in the middle of all that, that we as Christian people should be looking to show a way forward through all that.
Exactly right, and I'll come to that, that slant next, but next. Sorry.
Thank you very much for introducing us to this. I'm not overly familiar with it, but immediately I think about we've got this concept of one system, but unfortunately in our world we've got multiple systems, and it's a question of who is doing the viewing of this system or the analysis of this system. And so it becomes a question of how widely do we engage with people or do we have this this Greek idea of having these elders up the top who see the whole system and can do it for us, or which brings up the whole question of a democratic setup where, to what extent do you have everybody having input into it as they do in Switzerland?
Yep, absolutely right. One of the biggest questions in systems thinking is where do you draw the boundary for the system? And which systems overlap with that system, and then you get to those sorts of questions of power and influence, etc. Correct. Other questions or comments?
Faced with the truly horrifying scenarios that Kym has sketched, the real question seems to be, if people are going to do something about it, do they take a near-term view or a long-term view? If you take the near-term view, you become the President Trump, who says, make America great again, drill baby drill, with no thought of the consequences down the track. Whereas if you take the long-term view, you may find yourself dispossessed of your country's GDP, taking measures to move to renewable energy at great cost to industry and suffering the consequences. It's pretty hard to sacrifice all that in the interests of the long term.
Yes. Other questions or comments?
Going back to Max's comment that it's a Christian duty, I was thinking of the line from the Lord's Prayer, where we promise to do what's in heaven here on earth. And it struck me that is actually two different systems, and that we have got two different constraints on those two different systems. And I was thinking about some sexual laws at the time, and thinking that it was actually about touching ladies' bottoms. But in the natural world, that's a way of communicating. But in our current situation, that's illegal. And so in God's world, that is natural. But in our world, that is illegal. And it sort of makes you think that there's going to be this ongoing battle through every age between what God has provided in terms of nature and what we assemble in terms of our community. And so I'm looking forward to your next slides to see where you go with this.
Okay. Thank you for that. I will say a little bit about kingdom, heaven, earth, etc. in a moment, drawing on Brian McLaren as promoed. I'm not going to say anything about frottage or anything like that in terms of bottoms, so I'm afraid you'll have to go to the next one for that. Okay, well, I think we might move on, but fear not, there's 10 to 15 minutes for the next session for questions and comment, so there'll be plenty of time, I think. Okay, my Perth-based CSIRO colleague and subsequent head of the Australian Institute of Marine Science in Townsville, Dr. Paul Hardesty, provides a compelling example of polycrisis and hyperconnectivity. In his 2024 book, In Hot Water, Inside the Battle to Save the Great Barrier Reef, Hardesty writes, "The reef's fate is now inextricably linked to the fate of the planet. The 2,400 kilometre reef is a symbol of our struggle to rise above narrow self-interest and act for the common good." Hardesty shares an insider view of the conflict involving key actors attempting to shape the future of the reef since the major back-to-back bleaching events of 2016 and 2017, and again from 2023. Self-interested and ideological political and media strategies had been used to undermine public and stakeholder faith in careful and legitimate science. These include strategies used by US interest groups for tobacco and fossil fuels. After being misrepresented by climate-denying a few One Nation and National Party senators in Australian Senate estimates and inquiries, Hardesty acknowledges that scientists need to take time to better engage with key stakeholders to reduce misunderstanding and susceptibility to what he says is simplistic thinking driving us towards catastrophe, step by step, sleepwalking towards the cliff. Hardesty's hopeful note is that Great Barrier Reef corals can be saved if we delay the frequency and length of bleaching events to provide time to further research, trial and implement well-advanced adaptation strategies. For him, all is not quite yet lost. Hardesty's summary call to action is that global inequality has been growing too among nations, between rich and poor, between old and young. The more we have delayed action on climate change, the more we have pushed the costs of damage and eventual action onto younger people and future generations. But he says it doesn't have to be this way. There is still time to shape the future we want. We don't need soothing rhetoric about growth and ever-increasing wealth and no-pain solutions. No more pretending that we are somehow going to get through this without sacrifice. And this burden can only fall to people alive now. The time is now. We already have, he says, the technology. The only thing we still need to find is the will and the courage to act. Right now, there are battles that need to be fought. Hardisty's final chapter lists individual actions we can take and organisational and government actions, including in relation to taxing bads, not goods. So, we come to Brian McLaren. His book is titled Life After Doom, Wisdom and Courage for a World Falling Apart. McLaren is a respected and prolific American author. He escaped from a Plymouth Brethren fundamentalist upbringing, was a college English professor, and then an innovative and progressive pastor just outside Washington, DC, for 24 years before becoming a full-time author after turning 50. Now approaching 70, he's active in a range of spiritual, community, educational, environmental and political causes. Life After Doom goes well beyond the environmental messages he included in an earlier 2009 book, Everything Must Change. I'll just read a tiny bit from his introduction. You woke up again this morning with that familiar, unpeaceful, uneasy, unwanted feeling. You wonder what to do about it. You suspect that if you pay attention to it, it will unleash some inner turmoil. You could keep trying to ignore or suppress it, but that can't be good either. You see a book with this title and wonder, am I ready for this? My unpeaceful, uneasy, unwanted feeling could be ignored for another day, right? After all, it's only an intensifying and persistent sense of anxiety growing from the realisation that we humans have made a mess of our civilisation and our planet, and not enough of us seem to care enough to change deeply enough and quickly enough to save it. Or maybe it's even worse than that. Yes, enough of us care, but it's already too late for us to change fast enough to make a significant difference. It's the feeling that catastrophe of some sort is inevitable. I could go on. And I will come back to a couple more quotes from his book. In fact, I may just add one more now, which is him quoting Professor Mark Maslin about the 7 stages of climate denial. 1, it's not real. 2, it's not us. 3, it's not that bad. 4, we have time. 5, it's too expensive to fix. 6, here's a fake solution. And 7, it's too late. You should have warned us earlier. So after analysing a vast variety of research and interviewing key players, McLaren documents 4 possible scenarios for the future of planet Earth. All 4 scenarios involve doom loops and tipping points and are terrible, and increasingly so, with the worst going one step beyond the scenarios in the International Actuaries 2025 report. McLaren calls them collapse avoidance, the least bad, where destabilising Earth's life support systems will destabilise civilisation, leading to a downward spiral in both that initiates a long, difficult and messy transformation, but more serious collapse is avoided. 2, collapse rebirth, where insufficient urgency to trigger transformation leads to a decline towards collapse that has much greater impacts before a rebuilding based on new values, consciousness or spirituality. 3, collapse survival, where after collapse a remnant of humanity survives in brutal and pre-industrial conditions. And worst of all, collapse extinction, where a war with weapons of mass destruction speeds up environmental destruction, leading to mass extinction of most life forms on land and sea, including all or most humans. McLaren is open about his own despair and other emotions in dealing with the possible and likely scenarios of doom. The Christian denominations, sects and theologies that emphasise heavenly salvation for a predetermined elect contrast sharply with McLaren's views on the need to work thoughtfully, collectively and hard for God's kingdom now and save what remains of God's wonderful creation. He writes that the US Southern Baptist Union largely supports unfettered free market capitalism and small government and doesn't address climate change. Other religions also have large groups that emphasise heavenly salvation for an elect and welcome or actively seek martyrdom and apocalyptic end times. Extreme Christian, Muslim and Hindu theologies, such as in Russia, Iran and India respectively, support violent and expansionist autocratic or theocratic nationalism. McLaren argues that this and increasing concentration of power and wealth, corruption and exploitation and a growth paradigm undermine our ability to adequately respond to an overshoot of the Earth's long-term carrying capacity and ability to process waste. Yet, since the book's publication, a second Trump term is encouraging use of unbridled power rather than international law and norms, and seeking to facilitate a dramatic expansion of fossil fuel production alongside reduced environmental protection. McLaren stresses the need to consider how to be ethical and loving humans living in the shadow of such doom. Key themes in his analysis include our need to wake up and humbly face reality and grief, grapple with doom and speak our mind in circles of trust, embrace contemplation, poetry and detachment, while still doing the other things, seek understanding and Indigenous wisdom, appreciate the beauty in our heritage, actively hope against hope and don't give up. Avoid simplistic binaries and cognitive biases. So there's lots of these, but one of them is a confirmation bias that ignores uncomfortable or disconfirming data. Love freely and know that our loving will count no matter what. Prepare for our own death and commit to work for justice, peace and compassion as long as we live, based on thoughtful insight, agility and interdependence, because, based on the quote there, the things you are doing now as an individual really matter, and the many things we come together to do matter even more. So I can say more, but I think as per the slide about to come up, we'll have our second discussion period. Again, questions or comments, keep them pretty short. Come here because then people online can hear the question and the answer. And put up your hand if you'd like to comment or ask a question.
Again, I thank Max for giving me some direction on this. But the way I came to bottoms, my last comment, was actually for a lecture for the Freemasons. And of course, we work with tools as our symbols. And I was considering the dibber and the spoon auger We've got the gardeners here. Use the dibbers to plant the seeds. And of course, I realised for Freemasons things that's actually mentioned as Moses' staff in, I think it's Exodus. And the Lord asks him not to tap the rock, but to speak to the local indigenous population. And if any of you have read The Orchard, you'll realise that there was an indigenous population in Canaanite that lived underground, and they had their water systems underground. And they then influenced the Muslim religion. And subsequently, I would say that the disagreement or the lack of advice that Moses took actually led to this current Gaza system. And so I was very interested in how you said poetry and reflection, and that small step of not actually talking to local people about getting water not only kept the Israelites out of Canaan for 40 years, but led to 21st century problems. And in fact, exactly that, environmental problems to do with the usage of water and water sharing.
I don't profess to be an expert on any of that, so who else has got a comment or a question? Dr. Bach.
Kym, it struck me that McLaren's list of things to do in response are very individualistic. I think the only way a change is really going to happen is only with social movements. So you need a Martin Luther King to inspire a movement for African Americans having civil rights. And I don't know that we've yet got that movement that's coalesced in order. And the movements are usually outside the system. They're not part of the formal structures. They rely on charismatic leaders, but also they are very strong in being able to deal with the political, social and scientific realities. What do you think?
So I reckon that I know McLaren's American, and so they tend to be fairly individualistic, right? But he did try and emphasise the need for circles of trust working collaboratively, and in particular, this last quote, working for justice, peace and compassion based on thoughtful insight, agility and interdependence, so others, because the things you're doing now as an individual matter, so that is important, but the many things we come to do together to do matter even more. So I do think that, you know, that's his main thing. We're going to, if we be individuals, we're going to sink. The only chance that we're going to swim to some extent is collectively, and we need to do so in a way that, you know, picking up Max's earlier point, that there is some hope and that we can reduce some of the terrible things that will happen if we don't work together collectively, but thoughtfully. So anyway, I may have misrepresented McLaren, but obviously those points are his, not mine too. Yeah, please come up.
I would like to ask your opinion on, when we're coming together, do you think it's helpful to have demonstrations about particular issues, social justice issues, whatever, to come together for peaceful demonstrations? Do you think that has any real impact or is worth doing?
Yeah, well, I think it's a thing to do. I think it's important. Our daughters every year go to the demonstration on Parliament House steps that talk about that remembers those women who've lost their lives and been victims of domestic violence during the year. And it gets reported on the news, and I think it's important to keep doing that. And so there are many other demonstrations that can be useful as well. But if that's all you did, then those in power are unlikely to be particularly moved, depending on how big they are. I mean, you know, you look at South Korea, you look at a number of countries that have overturned regimes because they were refusing to move in a democratic direction. And it is possible to make change if you get ahead of steam in whichever country it may be. So demonstrations have got a track record that's positive, but they can also be ignored. But if you don't, so it's a part of a collective possibility, and you know, it will require sacrifice, I think. I don't know if I'm ready for it, but it's not. This whole thing is not going to be easy. Other questions or comments? Okay, I know I mean, McLaren's book is very attuned to the emotional impact of all of this stuff and the impact it had on him. I briefly mentioned that, but I mean, it has on younger people who decide they won't have kids because of these scenarios, and so many other terrible implications from what's happening. So, as Max says, you've got to somehow keep a balance between not being overwhelmed by it, but equally not desensitising yourself to it by trying to ignore it. So that's where we are, unfortunately, I think. And, you know, the science, the actuaries, the scientists and theologians are all kind of lining up, those who are more thoughtful, I think. Okay, we move to Don on the next slide, I think, which is... Well, sorry, conclusions first. Okay. So this won't be a surprise to you, right? Nothing new. In conclusion, sadly, we have reached a point where further devastating climate and environmental outcomes seem certain. What is at issue now is how we respond and adapt to what is inevitable and work hard to avoid the most terrible future scenarios. The Doomsday Clock and International Actuaries 2025 report underscore the science and wisdom in the books by McLaren and Hardesty and many others. Systems thinking, collaborative support and action groups will be essential to living ethically and lovingly in a time of polycrisis and hyperconnectivity. Other existential threats, such as wars with access to weapons of mass destruction, will require similar informed collective responses. Finally, here's a list of key references that I've cited. I'm pretty sure we can put this on the website a bit later on if people want to have a look at the talk or think about it further or talk to others about it. The red text at the bottom gives you access to some book reviews I've done. The first 5 of them are relevant to this topic. Thank you for your thoughtful attention, questions and comments. And now to the slide leading into next month, and Don to the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you, Kym, for on the one hand, a gloomy prognosis of the situation we find ourselves in, but at the same time a challenge for us, of people of good conscience, people who can take perhaps a longer view than others, that there is scope for us to act together, which I think was a theme that came out in the conclusion that Kym took. So thank you very much, Kym. It's been a very good start to our series of questions that we're asking this year in the program of PC Forum. There is a brochure, of course, that advertises our forum. If you haven't got one, there's a small supply outside if you go through the door, and it's on your left, I think. So pick one up if you haven't got one and you need one. Otherwise, there's always the web, the ELC website, Effective Living Centre website, and our own PCNet website has copies of the brochure. And like all brochures and like all programs, there is some evolution over time. And if you look closely at the present one, you'll find that this version is slightly different to what we issued a month ago, in that the August and September panels are now in a different, well, they're swapped. So if you've got a very old brochure and it comes to August and September, just watch it. You might get it wrong, but you still come along. Those of you who are on our mailing list will continue to receive reminders of our forthcoming events month by month. Remember, first Thursday of every month. And if you are not on our mailing list, please see at the desk and we'll add you to that, give your email address to whoever's there. There is a book title that you're going to hear about in 1 second. Also an advance notice about a conference being held in April of this year. So at this point I'll pass over to Fergus, who will give us some information on both those topics.
Thank you, Don. The conference, I think you're referring to the Adelaide Bonhoeffer Reading Group's conference in honour of the 80th anniversary of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's death. Mike Peach down the back there is the convener of the conference and the leader of the reading group. So on April 26, 27, correct, Mike, you'll be able to find information about this from the ELC website, and we'll do a mail out to all the ELC people shortly about the conference. 2 days, Saturday and Sunday, some great speakers. Who are the two speakers on Saturday, Mike? Mark Worthing. And Mark Lindsay from Melbourne. Then on Sunday we'll have a wonderful church service at Emmanuel Lutheran in Archer Street with none other than the Reverend Dr. Morris Schilt, a great man, as the preacher. And after that there'll be a great panel discussing the strongman phenomenon in the world today. So it will happen on a Saturday. So a reflective panel on the Sunday. So stay tuned for information. You can find info on the ELC website, and we'll do a mail out shortly about that, April 26, 27. Next week in PC Forum, who's this guy, Fergus McGinley, with the launch of the book, The God Who Doesn't Exist? Look at that. Next month. What did I say? Next week. Master 6. Don't come next Thursday. Come on Master 6. You can book for this through the normal process of booking for PC Forum events. And we'll have a lot of fun together next on Thursday of next month, Master 6. There'll be some great speakers. You'll get a bit of a serve from me, obviously. And then there'll be drinks and nibbles. So we'll ply you with booze so that it'll loosen your purse strings so that you can buy plenty of copies of the book. You can find information when you're booking or through the ELC website. There's a link there to my website where you can get some more detailed information about the book. But otherwise, love to see you all there next week. Not just because it's the next session of PC Forum, but because it's my book launch. Thank you. Now, back to you, Don.
Thanks, Fergus. You're very modest. You really should be promoting your book with a gavel or something and saying, you know, come along next month. It's going to be a great book launch and you'll learn things you don't know now and go home with a book under your arm. I just have 3 words to say. One is that if you're into books, as you go out the door on the left-hand side, you'll find there's a bookshelf on wheels which has some free books. They're actually the remnants of a library that I think Progressive Christianity collected at one stage, and they've been pretty hard to move. So if any of those books you tickle your fancy, just take one. But don't raid the library of the church. That will be getting a bit beyond the pale. But any that's on that trolley, that trolley type of shelf that's facing you, not on the other side, that's facing you, help yourself, they're free. That's the first word. The second one is, you might or might not have picked up a feedback sheet when you came in. If you didn't, please get one. We do value your feedback. It gives us a guide as to how our programs evolve. So just take a minute to have a look at the feedback sheet. Give a score to Kym. Of course, he rates well off the chart, but whatever you think. And any comments that you might make about tonight's program or against our total program for the year. And the final word is, supper is now served. So please make your way and enjoy a cup of hot or cold beverage. We don't have any wine tonight, that'll be the next month, and some nibbles. So thank you for coming. Been great having you, and please stay around and talk. Bye now.